Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. For those who are with us here in person and those who are joining us via the Zoom webinar, it's really a delight to welcome our guest today. I want to depart from our usual introductory remarks for a special announcement. Here at St. Mary's College, we are participating today in an annual fundraising tradition called Bells Giving Back. It's a donor challenge, and so this is an opportunity to remind the St. Mary's community, if you haven't given something yet today, even $1, that counts. We want as much participation as possible, and for our guests watching online, be a part virtually of the St. Mary's College community. Join us in supporting the great work here, and we'll have a link in the Zoom chat for you there. So now that commercial advertisement's out of the way, my name is Daniel Horan, and I'm professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. I'm so delighted to welcome you to this Ex Libris author lecture series event this afternoon. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan, with generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Center for Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, we draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our exciting event this afternoon, we wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land, and to honor the native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize our indigenous siblings and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. So the format for our program this afternoon is threefold. First, Dr. Battin will offer a brief presentation about his work. After that, my colleague, Dr. Julia Fetter, Associate Professor of Theology at Creighton University and Project Coordinator this year at the Center for Spirituality, will engage in a conversation on themes from his book. And then the third part is where you all get to participate more actively, where we'll open the floor for questions and comments, both from those gathered here in person and from our friends online. And just a reminder that for those who are here in person, our campus bookstore is present here with copies of Dr. Battin's book available for sale, and Dr. Battin will be around afterwards to help to meet you and to sign the books. He'd help direct you too. I don't know why I was saying that, but we want to promote the sale of the book, and we thank our bookstore for being here. Now it is my privilege to introduce our guest today. Dr. Stephen Battin is a native of New Orleans, Louisiana. He did his undergraduate degree at Xavier University of Louisiana, where he majored in computer science. He attended the University of Notre Dame for his Master in Theological Studies degree, as well as his PhD in systematic theology. Dr. Battin is now an assistant professor in the theology department at the University of Notre Dame. His present research contributes to the ongoing development of liberation theologies by way of placing Catholic theology in conversation with decolonial, indigenous, and African American-based post-capitalist movements. He is especially committed to the exploration of ecclesiology, Christology, and soteriology from non-dominant perspectives. He is with us this afternoon to discuss his book, Intercommunal Ecclesiology, The Church, Salvation, and Intergroup Conflict. So please join me in extending a warm St. Mary's College welcome to Dr. Stephen Battin.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, and all of you who are here this evening, in person and online. And thanks to the Center for Spirituality for giving me the opportunity to speak publicly about this book for the first time, and with such wonderful conversation partners. This book, Intercommunal Ecclesiology, is about the interconnection between the church and the historical problem of violent intergroup relationships. It is concerned with how human psychology influences theological discourse about Christian community, and how theology can influence our collective perceptions, psyche, and behavior when it comes to our dealings with non-Christian or differently Christian communities. As a point of entry for exploring the pitfalls and creative possibilities of this entanglement, I shall begin with a few comments on two juxtaposed quotes to open this introduction. The first is from a Western European Catholic theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, a proponent of resourcing traditions of the Church Fathers. The second from James Baldwin, an African-American novelist, essayist, and civil rights activist who is highly regarded as an important voice in the Black radical tradition within the United States. Balthasar writes, "Man was the church. He stood in the sphere of light and holiness, but reflections on the church became necessary when the question of her structure arose. Men first became conscious of this question as they looked at those outside, as they considered the nature of heresy or Judaism. Here was a mirror in which they saw, as in a negative, the contours of the church. It is this unreflexive consciousness that alone explains, after a fashion, what is most difficult to grasp of all the various decisions in the church's history, though they were, in fact, not conscious decisions." James Baldwin writes, his quote is shorter, "I would like us to do something unprecedented, to create ourselves without finding it necessary to create an enemy." These two statements were written within a year of each other, but they represent two different ways a human community can imagine its relationship with other human communities. Two ways of imagining the relationship between us and them, antagonistically and collaboratively. In my opening remarks tonight, I will introduce you to the book by way of speaking about three crucial nodes, let's say, within a larger network of argumentation. First, intergroup conflict in relation to moral exclusion. Second, moral exclusion in relation to dominant ecclesiologies. And three, the church's intergroup relations relative to the salvation logic of Christ. First, intergroup conflict in relation to moral exclusion. In order to capture a range of phenomena, a range of examples of intergroup conflict, aggression, and indifference, under one umbrella term, I borrow the concept of moral exclusion from social psychologist Susan Apatow. According to Apatow, moral exclusion occurs when individuals or groups are perceived as outside the boundary in which moral values, rules, and considerations of fairness apply. According to Apatow, communities have a scope of justice, and I would add to this a scope of empathy, the parameters of which constitutes a moral boundary. Within this scope, people who share a consolidated group identity will display toward their fellow members a concern for fairness, a willingness to sacrifice for another's well-being, and willingness to share community resources with another. Those outside the scope of obligation are morally excluded. They're morally excluded from this community and therefore subject to varying degrees of disregard for fairness, well-being, and just resource allocation. More importantly, Apatow notes those perceived outside this boundary often are considered non-entities, undeserving, or somehow lacking in mind. This perception opens the door for treating outside persons and groups as eligible targets of harm and exploitation, especially when such harm doing seems to be in the service of a supposed greater good. I was interested in exploring the mental mechanisms, or the psychological preconditions to this moral exclusion, which brought me to 3 cognitive processes that I'd like to briefly mention. Unless otherwise noted, everyone I cite here is a social psychologist. The first is in-group, out-group psychology, which refers to the cognitive propensity to classify people according to whether or not they are a member of your group. Regarding the psychology of insiders and outsiders, J. Van Bavel writes that the human brain is constantly filtering the world in a manner that reinforces the goals and values of our favorite group, whether that involves political affiliations, national identities, or our hometown baseball team. The capacity for differentiating and organizing into insiders and outsiders provides the infrastructure for the moral exclusion that I described earlier. As anthropologist Donald E. Brown has remarked, a mental mechanism designed to discharge a particular function may have side effects or byproducts. While this mechanism for processing information of human types must have evolved in conditions where racial differentiation was rarely, if ever, perceived, it has left the human mind effectively prepared to think about races in particular ways. Thus, racial thinking has flourished in recent times because it parasitizes a mechanism that was designed for other purposes. And that's the point I want to highlight, this development of the mind that can be parasitized for other purposes, because it's not only for the purposes of racial thinking. This mental mechanism, informed by specific cultures, conditions how we relate to people based on perception of group membership. The second psychological mechanism is parochial altruism. The term parochial altruism refers to the tendency for individuals to self-sacrifice in order to benefit their own group, and to derogate, hurt, and sabotage competing outgroups. The work of Karsten DeDrew and colleagues shows how parochial altruism is activated by the perception of threat from an outgroup, though the threat need not be real. An interesting point here is that the violence associated with this mental mechanism is not motivated by outgroup hate, but in-group love. The third fascinating mental mechanism contributing to moral exclusion is called infrahumanization. The work of J.P. Lands and colleagues has demonstrated that infrahumanization is distinct from cognitive dehumanization, in that infrahumanization does not mean that in-group members see other communal groups as non-human, but as less than fully human. So there's a little nuance there. And a feature of infrahumanization is that whatever in-groups think of as uniquely human and essential to humanity, its members tacitly attribute to the in-group and tacitly deny to perceive communal outgroups and their members. And we can begin to think about how some of these mental mechanisms that contribute to moral exclusion are prevalent in our world and our society today, but we can also start to think about how they might manifest in the church. Now, as Lands and colleagues stress, the infrahumanization processes are not immediately associated with extremely negative evaluations of groups. While infrahumanization implies a sense of out-group inferiority, it does not imply a strong idea of in-group superiority. So there's out-group inferiority, but not necessarily in-group superiority. Other things have to happen for that to occur. Moreover, infrahumanization happens in the absence of intergroup conflict, whereas a group superiority complex, it commonly grows out of a conflict situation. So infrahumanization can and does occur without the idea of superiority or dehumanization. Now, I want to stress here that the group-related processes that I've just outlined are not indicators of sin. These processes are part of being human as God created us. They are as integral to existing in God's image and likeness as they are in enabling sinful group interactions. Which scenario we actualize depends on how we decide collectively to be community within our intercommunal relationships. Therefore, I want to end this section with clarifying remarks from Stephen Riker's article. There is nothing inherent about in-group process that tends to either ill or good. Indeed, the same underlying psychological processes can lead to both good and ill. Which of these eventuates has nothing to do with the nature of either humans or groups. Rather, it has to do with choices people make about the way they define their groups. How then do Christian communities define their groups? This question takes us to ecclesiology, examining the Christian community's self-understanding, its reflection on itself. The way we think about who we are, what we are about, and what makes us distinct makes a difference. Because the theological discourse about the church is the discourse by which we define our group. So let us then turn to the second node, moral exclusion in relation to dominant ecclesiologies. In his book, The Splendor of the Church, Henri de Lubac, influential 20th century Catholic theologian and historian, writes that in the classic manifestations of the first centuries of the Christian era, her, that being the church, her self-expression has a superb vitality. The idea of the church is everywhere, and everywhere shapes the expounding of the faith. But de Lubac goes on to make another observation concerning the patristic church's ecclesiology, that is, its way of thinking about Christian community, that touches directly upon the problem of intergroup relations. De Lubac writes, at a very early stage, she, the church, is compelled to begin the process of reflection on herself. Every one of the great heresies that she has to fight forces this upon her. Hans Urs von Balthasar echoes the same observation in the quote that we read earlier, and I'll read part of it just to remind us. Reflection on the church became necessary when the question of her structure arose. Men first became conscious of this question as they looked at those outside, as they considered the nature of heresy or Judaism. Here was a mirror in which they saw, as in a negative, the contours of the church. It is this unreflexive consciousness that alone explains, after a fashion, what is most difficult to grasp of all the various decisions in the church's history, though they were, in fact, not conscious decisions. So I would like to draw attention to a few points. What de Lubac describes as the early church's super vitality in self-expression is intimately bound up with an aggressive, competitive encounter with forces outside itself. It is important to note, however, that what actually is occurring is not an aggressive, conflictive, winner-take-all competition between a bad idea, as heresies, and a good idea, orthodoxy, as de Lubac's language strongly suggests. Rather, the process of orthodox ecclesial self-reflection to which de Lubac is referring emerges from within specific contexts of confrontation with other Christian communities, as well as other non-Christian communities. The church was not forced to fight great heresies. Rather, as Balthasar acknowledges, it was compelled by unconscious forces. Remember the psychological processes we were talking about? Unconscious forces. It was compelled by these unconscious forces to either start fights or respond aggressively in kind with other distinct human communities, namely the Judeans and those whom Christian polemicists branded pagans and heretics. However, for Balthasar, the important task of perceiving the structure of the church as a whole involves a negative construction of the other. That is to say, the church's communal self-understanding requires the creation of an enemy. This approach to ecclesiology grows out of and perpetuates the problem of intergroup conflict. The ecclesiological questions for the church fathers were, what makes a community the church, and what makes another community not the church? With these questions at the center of their ecclesiology, their way of thinking about Christian community, the early Christian intelligentsia diligently preoccupied itself with constructing the imagined social limits, the immutable theological content, and the unique, unrepeatable characteristics of the Christian in-group. In conjunction with this process of communal self-definition, through oppositional comparison, they also defined non-Christian outgroups. These early developments in ecclesiology, in the Christian in-group's self-definition, has influenced much of Catholic and non-Catholic ecclesiology through the centuries up to today. So what might an alternative approach to thinking about the church entail? This leads us to the third node, the church's intergroup relations relative to salvation, the salvation logic of Christ. In the book, I attempt to outline a theological strategy for recovering a more robust and holistic understanding of salvation that can help us in understanding the church as a human community in relationship to other human communities, and run interference on the psychological processes of moral exclusion, which contribute to intergroup conflict, aggression, and indifference. This entails several moves, but I will highlight one that might be of interest to you tonight. One place we find a helpful insight into the logic of salvation is in the 4th century Christological controversies, that is, in the debates over Christ's nature. Gregory of Nazianzus provides us with one of the most important salvation-related statements. He says that which is not assumed is not saved. This is in reference to Jesus' incarnation. That which is not assumed is not saved. Or in other words, if God has not touched it, it remains unhealed and consequently totally subject to the reign of death. The idea is that the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, assumes, that is, took on, not only flesh, but the entirety of human nature. That means mind, body, soul, spirit, everything except sin. And in doing so, through his divine person, he was able to unite human nature and divine nature and thereby fully heal humanity. I want to contend that we can bring Gregory of Nazianzus' insight forward. Our humanity is not only our body, our mind, our soul, our spirit. Our humanity is also our culture, our location, and our communal belonging. To be human is to be a social creature. To be human is to belong to a group or several groups of humans. And to be human also often means being in a human group that exists in relationship to other human groups. So from a Christian perspective, if Jesus has not in some way assumed this aspect of our humanity, then it has not been touched by God, and it has not been marked with the capacity for transformation, not only in the next life, but in this one. So the salvation logic of Gregory of Nazianzus is legitimate and life-affirming, but its scope also needs to be expanded and informed by our current knowledge of human beings, as well as our modern sensitivities to violence, injustice, inequality, and various forms of harm-doing. In the book, I attempt several updatings of biblical and patristic thought on salvation as a way of thinking and talking about the church, that is the Christian community, differently. So I'll conclude by saying that the overarching goal of the book, in practical terms, is to establish a theologically informed basis for Christian communities to open themselves up to the present tasks of conflict transformation. By facing the structural, historical, cultural, and social psychological preconditions for the church's past and ongoing participation in intergroup violence. I share James Baldwin's hope to do something unprecedented, to create ourselves without finding it necessary to create an enemy. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you all tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a beautiful introduction to, I think, what's really a beautiful book about who we are as human beings and how God takes on our humanity in all the way down, as you say, all the way down, and invites us into salvific intergroup relationships, right? I wanted to ask first about the way that you approach this topic. In your introduction, you place this conversation, this discourse that you're having within a broader tradition of non-European traditions of critical analysis. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about what that means and why that's important, particularly in light of this topic, intercommunal unity.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Julia. I would say that the importance of the non-Western European or non-dominant intellectual tradition for me, it's central growing up as African American male in the United States, because the thinkers that Julia is referring to, the first is W.B. Du Bois, the second is Frantz Fanon, and the third is actually a Latin American philosopher and theologian, Enrique Dussel. And as I encountered their work, I found them giving intellectual voice to something that I had experienced myself growing up in the South, in New Orleans. These moments of encounter with a person where they say something, they look at you a certain way, they treat you differently than they treated somebody else. And in this context, of course, you're dealing with racialization. So you learn to experience yourself as black very early on, and others as white. And so that experience fed into me wanting to consider the other kinds of intergroup relationships throughout history. And as I looked at these thinkers and studied these thinkers, I saw that they too were actually concerned with intergroup relationships. They talked about it differently, right? Du Bois talks about the color line, right? The importance of the color line at the start of the 20th century. Fanon talks about the colonized and the colonizer, right? Dussel talks about the relationship between the global North and the global South. And so all these thinkers within this kind of critical intellectual tradition, they aren't concerned necessarily with metaphysics, what's happening in some realm that we can't see or what have you. They have very sharp intellectual, there's very sharp intellectual rigor, but it's always informed by the question of how do we reconcile these various divisions, whether it's racial, colonial, or global North, global South. Mm-hmm. And I'll just say, I wanted to do an ecclesiology in the mold that they were doing sociology, philosophy, and psychology.
Mm-hmm. That's leads me to what I labeled as what I wanted to ask you next anyway, which was that the church, and you really argue very clearly that the church is first and foremost a human group. Mm-hmm. It's not, and here's a quote from you, it's not a supratemporal theological entity that exists in some ontological modality independently from us. And in other places you say, we need to be talking about the church phenomenologically and sociologically, not ontologically and ecclesiastically. So why is this important? What's the problem with talking about the church in abstract terms? What does that miss?
Right. So talking about the church in abstract terms, one of the first ones being the church as mother. So we talk about the church as the body of Christ. That's not as abstract. But the next development was the church as the bride of Christ. And there were reasons for that. And that still associates the church, the human group, with Christ. Now, once we get to mother, something else starts to happen. Now the church is a she. It's something else that embraces us, right? It's no longer, the church is no longer us. And when we look in the biblical text, the church is first and foremost a human group. It's a community. The title ecclesia means assembly. It's a political term, right? If the church had its first idea of itself as some sort of extension of a separate metaphysical entity, they would have spoken about it that way. But that wasn't the case. We see that as a development. And so my concern is that once you start to posit something that is over and above the human, especially in Western thought, the identity of that thing is going to be associated with the thing that is over and above, or with the aspect that is over and above. And so now we can talk about a sin, for instance, and many people have done this in the Catholic Church, right? The church is really without sin. It's the members of the church who are sinners, right? And that just becomes a way of absolving the church as a collective reality from the damage that it's done. So I think these are kind of slippery ways of really avoiding responsibility in some ways.
Yeah. I think one thing that was, I loved when, I'm going to read an extended quote from you. As fully human, Jesus, like us, was a social creature. Jesus felt the pangs of belongingness needs, the first prompt to interpersonal intimacy, as well as committed group membership. As with us, Jesus needed community, and his embeddedness in community was part of his constitution as a human person. As a consequence of his full humanity, Jesus accepted that he could not carry out his mission, his ministry alone. And I think that's just something that really moved me, the way that you describe the church as a human community. It represents both some of the best of what humanity can be and the worst of what humanity can be, fully embracing all the breadth of what humanity really is. And Jesus, as fully human, needed a community too, and that God needs a community to act. So I wonder if you could talk more about the vision of Jesus that you're putting forward in this text, and Jesus's relationship and the church as the body of Christ. Why is that image of the church such an important one for you?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. So the book is structured in 3 parts, and the first part is dealing with the human group. The human group sort of as a living system, and then the human group in terms of the kind of social psychology that I talked about earlier. The second part deals with the church, deals with salvation, and the third part is dealing with Jesus. And the reason for that is because my claim is that when you're talking about the church theologically, you need 3 things. 3 things make up the church. First and foremost, you need a human group. Secondly, you need God's plan of salvation. And third, if it's the Christian church, you need Christ. So, God can be God without a human community, but the human community can't be the church without God. It can't be a Christian church without Christ. And so in the section you're talking about, that's sort of an extended reflection on Jesus through the lens that I set up early on in the book, that is looking through the lens of the human group, how a human group is constituted, how a human group interacts with other human groups, right, or communities of culture, if you will. And so Jesus is important for that reason, and his connection with what we might call the kind of human group phenomenon is important. And so I approach that in 2 different ways. First, I think maybe the section you read from was dealing with how the church comes about and has a almost material relationship to Jesus, because Jesus, as a human, started in actual community, right? And so there's a kind of genetic relationship between every Christian group, Catholic, Lutheran, Episcopalian, what have you, right? As different as we may be, there's still, and it's not apostolic succession per se. It's something that's a little more maybe interesting than that. But so there's a connection there. To the earthly Jesus, to Jesus during his life. But also, we have to look on the other side of Easter with the resurrected Jesus, right? As we say that Jesus is still alive. It's the same Jesus who was born, who lived, who died, and was raised. And within this resurrected mode of life, Jesus still connects with us, but in a different way than the way Jesus did when he began this human group, or the human groups that have kind of spawned out from this group. And is there something else or more specific you want me to say about the body of Christ?
Well, I'm just thinking, I mean, I was really moved by the distinctions that you were making when you talked about Jesus' resurrected body. The church is not a distinct body. It is Jesus' body transfigured. And the church is Christ's, I liked your word, engroupment. The church is Christ's engroupment in history. And so this engroupment is, I mean, I don't want to talk too much in your own words to you, but just the idea that this is the ongoing incarnation.
Right, yeah. And so I was going to mention that in my little intro, my opening remarks, but I had to cut some things out. But that's one of the other ways that we think about Jesus in terms of logic of salvation. And so I'm not quite sure exactly how to talk about this, because in some ways it's very personal, in that maybe since the time I was around your age, for some reason I was really drawn to this image. I say in the book it's actually more than an image, the body of Christ. When you think about claims related to the church in the Bible, one of the only sort of revelations we have about the church, right? He said there's a revelation of God, a revelation that God is one, all these different revelations that Jesus is God's Son. But the only revelation we really have in the Bible regarding the church is Sir Paul on the road to Damascus, where Jesus says that you're persecuting me. Right? Paul says, who are you? He says, why are you persecuting me? He says, who are you? He says, I am Jesus who you're persecuting, right? So Jesus makes a direct connection between himself and this persecuted community, right? This group. And so and so we find in Paul's letters this language of the body of Christ. So I think in some ways it's one of the most within our theology, we can get very sort of, doctrinal and dogmatic. But within the biblical text, this body of Christ imagery seems to be one of the most concrete sort of mystical things that we find there. And I think I would say that needs to be preserved. So I was interested in sort of unpacking that in relationship to this issue of intergroup conflict, aggression, indifference, and violence. So I guess there's more that could be said, but maybe that's sufficient.
Yeah.
If not, you can.
Yeah, no, I think one thing that was, really interesting about that conversation you have in the book, and then maybe we can open up for questions from other folks, but you point out Jesus, the voice isn't saying to Paul on the road, why are you persecuting my people? Mm-hmm. Or why are you persecuting others? Mm-hmm. He's saying, it was really powerful when he said, why are you persecuting me? There's this identification with the community is so thorough that this is Christ's own body, the persecuted people.
Yeah, and I'll just add that Archbishop Oscar Romero talks about the church sort of being the continuing hands and feet of Christ. This is something that you find within the tradition in various ways, right? It kind of pops up and then kind of goes back down. So this isn't just me saying that. I'm making a pretty strong assertion, but I'm drawing not just on the Bible, but on other figures from the patristic period, the church fathers, but also some modern figures from the 1800s or what have you. So this insight keeps kind of recycling, and I wanted to connect it with the reality of groups, because no one has quite spoken about it in this way, even though they're saying Jesus is closely associated with, identifies with the church, but they haven't talked about the church as being a human group. And then what does that mean? And the last thing I'll say is Latin American liberation theologian Jan Sobrino talked about this from a different angle. He talked about the lordship of Christ. And he said, well, how is it if Christ is now Lord of everything? Why is there still suffering? Right? Well, one of the points that he made is that, and he's sort of drawing on Romero in this, that Jesus' lordship is different, that he's become so identified with us that he's put himself sort of in our hands, at our disposal. And so really what we do or don't do, you could say in some ways has an effect on Jesus, or at least the risen Jesus's body, if it is the church. When we do things that really, really harm others in other communities, we're sort of disassociating Jesus from his body when we begin to think about it in the way that I'm suggesting.
Thank you. That's really beautiful and provocative. So I wonder if there might be some questions from those who are gathered here in person or online. We can open up the conversation.
Do I take this off?
I can talk about it.
It's the folks online we're bringing.
You know what, do you want to have my mic
Why don't
for
I,
this process?
yeah, why don't I run around with that? That's great, thank you. Good idea.
Hello, online viewers. Could you talk a little bit more about how you were saying with suffering in the church? I think a lot of people do connect with that of like, why does God allow suffering? And talk a little bit more about like Jesus putting himself on this earth and like to allow his son to be crucified. And then like, I guess that's all. That's all
Okay.
I'd like to ask.
Those are just small questions. Just yeah, those are pretty big and big questions. What could I say? So, I guess one thing that I would say, I'm not sure how I would relate them directly to the ecclesiology, that is the talk about the church. So if I understand your question, there are different camps about like what is most salvifically potent. They're not camps. I guess they overlap. They're not like fighting one another. But throughout Christian tradition, right? There's been an emphasis in different places, right? The Church of the East tended to place emphasis on incarnation, right? So of course there's the death and the resurrection, but since you can't have that without the incarnation, it's really that incarnation. Everything else is wrapped up in that. So that's the salvific stuff, so to speak. Then you have a tradition that says, the salvation is on the cross. It's when Jesus dies. Right? Some scholars think that the earliest Christians really placed emphasis on the resurrection. Right? So perhaps Paul and others, if you read the opening verses to Romans. So I would say, I just feel like this is a larger theological question. So there's that part of it. Now, if you place the salvation on the cross explicitly, then certain questions start to arise. But even with respect to the resurrection, I think you're sort of asking, like, why would God send God's Son to die, right? So this again is a big question. There's some theologians who would say that that's not why Jesus was sent in the first place, and so the resurrection is really a vindication of Jesus' life, and so there's salvation, as you say, like in spite of Jesus' death, not because of Jesus' death, right? So you can go online and find a real good talk about that from some people that are here. But hopefully that's enough to give you a sense. Sorry for the survey, because it was a big one, so I just give you a sense of what people say.
Okay, so I'm in her religious class, and we're talking about the life of Jesus. And you mentioned how Jesus created a community. Like, can you go further on that and explain, like, if he knew he was creating this community, and if he didn't, then what led you to think that, like, he made this community?
Right. So, I'll say about anything that, I could be wrong. But with that proviso, I would probably be I would lean in the direction of scholars who talk about the early church as the Jesus movement. And so when we're looking at the early history of the church or Christianity, we have to recognize that the term Christianity only occurs in the Bible twice. If you look at the letters of Paul, the word Christian doesn't occur. Well, Christianity doesn't occur in the Bible at all, but the word Christian occurs twice. In the letters of Paul, which are our oldest letters, the word Christian doesn't occur at all. Paul didn't know the term, right? He would just say the community in Christ. And so when you look at this, it seems like there's, we can see people moving in a certain way. We can see this kind of, what we would say today, religious movement, but also a social movement. And so the early writers we have are always referring to and pointing back to Jesus. So one way of talking about this community before it was called Christian and before it conceived of itself more abstractly as Christianity, there was a Jesus movement. So that's the reason why I would lean towards saying that Jesus sort of intentionally created a community. I guess I would go further to say the reason for this community, so theologically, at least as the argument in the book, is that this community should, from the perspective of kind of historical ongoing salvation, should counteract intercommunal aggression, conflict, indifference, although historically it's never really done that. But I would say that's a theological failure in understanding what church is actually supposed to be about.
Okay. So you spoke in your introduction about how talking about the church as something that embraces us can be used as a way of excuse for intergroup violence. How do we identify when we're viewing the church as depositing over us and being separate, and how do we respond when we notice that happening?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Well, part of me wants to say, well, it's almost like you'll know it when you see it, or when you read it. And I'll give you an example. And part of what I'm responding to is, maybe should I name names because I'm being recorded? But it's the late Benedict XVI, in his position of the head of the CDF. They put out a few documents about the church. And one of the things that made it into these official documents was sort of his own personal take, which is that the church is ontologically, the universal church is ontologically and temporally prior to any local church. So there's a larger conversation going on among European theologians about the universal church and the local church, and particularly after Vatican II, right, and how those two are related. And he wanted he wasn't saying that they weren't related, and sometimes it's unclear as to what he's referring to when he refers to the universal church. But this universal church is ontologically and temporally prior. And it does fit, at least rhetorically, with the kind of Neoplatonic philosophical tradition where you have humans and the church have sort of two components: our material bodily component and our spiritual or intellectual component. And so when you hear that sort of thing, you would recognize it. But one of the, especially if you're reading Catholic theologians writing in the 50s and stuff, there's a lot of this kind of, there's a transcendental side of the church. The church, like Christ, is human and divine, or human and spiritual, right? But I would say that the church is, I guess you could say, human and divine, but the divine part is the risen Christ. The divine part is not some third thing or some fourth thing apart from Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and then church. If that helps. But I would just say it's more performatively the way that this can be used to distance distance the actual community from, from the church and its responsibilities.
You mentioned how God takes our humanity all the way down and invites us into intergroup relationships. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering how you would say he does this exactly, or if you could maybe just clarify that a little bit more.
Yeah. So I think in part I'm sort of responding to offering an alternative to, again, it's actually kind of a Neoplatonic philosophical idea that that Jesus comes down and then Jesus returns up, and so the movement of Jesus coming down, or the Logos of the Son coming down and then returning up, Exodus Reditus would be sort of the technical term. It's to bring us back up, right? It's to take us out of this world. My contention, and it's not just me, I'm drawing on other sort of contemporary 20th century theologians, but my contention would be that, in my sense of things, would be that it's about God being present to us, right? So it's not about lifting us into heaven or into the Platonic realm of ideas. It's about God drawing near. That's why in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus preaches the kingdom, and the message is that the kingdom is near, or the kingdom has come near, right? And so I'm simply taking that emphasis that we find in the Synoptic Gospels, along with insights from 20th, 21st century theologians, and I guess you say my own spirituality, a sense of how things work, and saying that it is about Jesus like being human all the way down, and God. It is a Catholic kind of sacramental thing as well, right? It's God's presence. It's not about taking us out, but it's about God coming in.
I was wondering if you had any specific strategies for how like church group members could promote like intergroup unity with other non-group members.
Yeah. Strategies. Well, I'm just a theologian, so I'll So since I wrote this, so it took some time to finish editing and revising some things and getting it published, but other studies have come out, especially in the last several years, right? Really engaging this question. People have been doing the social psychology work for a while, but certain things have come to the fore. For instance, if, at least according to something called social identity theory, right? Your sense of self also contains, I guess you could say, an image, if you will, of the group to which you belong, right? And so if it's brought to your attention that members of your group have done something wrong, let's say something violent, something that contradicts your sense of being a good person, you can have two reactions. You can say, oh wow, that's terrible. We need to reform, we need to course correct. Or, and this I think may tend to happen more often, you can hunker down and basically sort of ignore that information, right? So we don't know why humans do one or the other. And so I think that, especially looking at that, it does become complicated. So how would you get the church, or at least the majority of the church, on board to consider how to do our intergroup relationships differently, right? But I do think that one sort of strategy and this may be a very weak one, but within the church, would be to look at the teachings of Jesus and start thinking about them differently, right? So it says, if you try to save your own life, you'll lose it, right? So it's not about saving your own life. And so we hear that and we say, oh, that's Jesus speaking to me. That's an instruction for me as an individual. And we process everything at the level of the individual. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us to talk about this at the level of the group, but the Bible is also written at a certain time and place, and the people that wrote it, they didn't know some things that we know now. They didn't have some categories that we have now. Some of our categories are kind of bogus. Some of our categories give us insight into reality. I think this group, social psychology group analysis is closer to reality. So one thing that we could do in church is take these teachings and actually sort of say, what would this look like if we apply this at the collective level rather than the individual level? As a church, should we always try to hunker down if we get called out about something, right? Maybe we should be, when we go into a new place, maybe we should be willing to let some things go that we thought were important, but maybe they aren't, right? The things we think give us life, maybe they don't. Maybe we shouldn't cling to them so much. So that might be sort of one strategy, just teaching this and thinking this way in our churches.
I think we have time for maybe one more question or comment.
I have 5 more questions, but I'll just give you one. I was really struck when you were talking about parochial altruism by you saying that it's not hatred of the other group that often causes animosity or conflict. It is often love of the in-group. I would love for you to talk about what sort of like group pride or group love looks like. What good group love looks like, right? Because often people they're proud of their group, they're proud of their identity with that group. But is there a way to do that without it causing the kind of negative, harmful intergroup conflict that you're moving us away? And I'm thinking particularly about love for the church, maybe love for being Catholic or Christian more broadly.
Right, yeah, thank you. Yeah. That's a great question. Well, first, I think one of the things that I try and emphasize somewhere in the book, in that section dealing with moral exclusion, is that, and I alluded to it here, that some of these things are, that's the way we are. So I guess you could say, well, maybe we're that way because of the fall, but maybe we're that way because it's just how we are, and that's, how God made us or allowed us or let us be. And so I would correlate that tendency for in-group love with individual personal self-love. And self-love is, I think, important. Sometimes it's been derogated within the Western philosophical and theological tradition. But I think it's important. Self-love can go awry, right? But self-love can also be the basis for loving the other. Hence, love the other as you love yourself. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, which presumes that you do love yourself. So how, again, would we apply that at the group level and in our intergroup relationships, right? To have this love for self, but to use that as a model for how we love others, as opposed to allowing it to deviate into a more dangerous or harmful direction.
As Dr. Koblenz said, there are probably dozens and dozens more questions folks have. And a great way to answer some of those questions are to continue talking to Dr. Battin in just a moment when we wrap up our formal event. And another great way is to buy his book and read the whole thing for yourself. Just a reminder and a plug for our bookstore present here. Let me, one other announcement item before I offer some notes of thanks, and that is our next Ex Libris Author Series event will be on Tuesday, March 7th, so in just a few weeks, where we'll have 3 of the editors and contributors of the volume Unruly Catholic Feminists here to talk with us. It's going to be really exciting, so please mark your calendars and join us in person or via Zoom. Let me first thank you all for joining us virtually and in person for the excellent questions we've received. Thanks to my colleague, Dr. Julia Fetter, for this wonderful engagement on the topics of this book, and a special thanks, and I hope you will join me in thanking again Dr. Stephen Battin for sharing with us his research and insights and leaving us with more questions than we came with, which is the sign of a really intellectually stimulating time. So thank you, Dr. Battin.
Thank you. Thank you.